Hello Spark fans and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where today we are continuing our voyage into Delta live tables. Most importantly, today we're looking at the SQL side of life. Now when we're doing a ton of data engineering, it's really easy to get sucked into the Pyspark, Scala, I'm using a programming language because everything's dynamic and I'm building a framework and, you know, SQL, that's just for ad hoc querying, right? And whilst there are merits to that argument, it's also the de facto lingua franca of how we do business transformation. It is how we go about defining transformations, calculations. It's how the business understand the data. You need to have SQL somewhere in there. So the fact that by default Delta Live Tables supports SQL and supports a purist SQL only syntax is pretty cool. Now the thing that we saw released last week before is that kind of nice combination, the jamming together of SQL and Pyspark that we use all over the place in terms of data engineering. So the ability to use things like spark.table to refer to a Hive SQL table, but then do a load of Pyspark on it. And the ability to say, I want to spin up a data frame that I'm using as a Delta Live table by doing spark.sql and then throwing a load of SQL at it. And that means we can use the best of both worlds. We can use mix and match between the different things that we're doing. And also it changes how dynamic we can make things. And that, you know me, that's what I love. So we're going to have a look at that. So yeah, SQL in Delta Live Tables. That's what we're doing. If it's your first time around here, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And otherwise, let me know down in the comments what you think of Delta Live Tables so far. Again, caveats everywhere. It is still in preview. If you go into Databricks and you don't see Delta Live Tables, probably because you're not on the preview, you can request it from Databricks. It is a public preview. But again, it'll be rolled out at some point in the future for everybody to have a play with. So let's get started. All right. Okay. So this is the bit I was talking about in terms of the new bit. We skimmed over it when talking about all the July updates. We've got this new thing, the ability to use spark.table and spark.sql. So that's what I'm talking about as there's the new bit in the giant new thing that we're talking about that's all in preview and all new, but there's new and then there's new, right? Sure. Okay, so we'll dig into that. But first, I want to talk about these two. So if you go onto the Delta Live Tables docs, there is this kind of quick start, which we used as a demo last time. And at the end of it, I kind of briefly pointed at this and said, look, here's a SQL version. And they are doing the exact same thing. So we went through and we said, I want to do this. So I want to define a bronze table, an initial raw table. And that's going to be spark.read.json. Nice, happy, familiar syntax. Defined as a Delta Live table. And it's taking in a parameter. So that little section there, if we've got the exact same thing as SQL, instead of having that @DLT syntax and wrapping things in a lot of that kind of function decorator, we've now got create live table. So this for me is nicer because this is so much closer to the everyday syntax you'd use. So if we had a user who was just using standard Spark and they said create table as select, and they can go and do all that, that's just syntax that works. That's fine, nothing crazy there. The only difference here is it's create live table. That's it. Otherwise, that is exactly the same syntax that people will use. So the fact that, yeah, in the standard one, we've got to wrap it inside a function. We need to define it as a return for what the data frame is going to be. We need to have this little @DLT table decorator. Basically, the SQL side is just a little bit more in line to what we expect. So first things first, proof is in the pudding, right? I just went and did a DLT with SQL. Just copy that and paste that in. So I got this whole SQL-y bit and went dump, threw it into a notebook, separate that out into cells because I can't help myself, and then just threw this into a standard job. So I've not made any changes here. This is the straightforward, exact same one that you can do. So you can just take that same code on the quick start, paste it into yours, and I created a Delta Live Table job over it. Again, to step through, there have been some changes to the Delta Live Table UI since I did a demo. I think it was only 2 weeks ago and things have changed. That's the joy of preview, right? So quickly show you those same things. So if I click on create pipeline, this window's changed a little bit. So pipeline names, give me my SQL pipeline, Piplieni. Sure. I point to the library that I had it in, which is that DLT with SQL. I can now add multiple extra notebooks. So if I've got all of my different Delta Live tables just described in different notebooks, I can actually now set up a single job and say, here's all the notebooks that you need. Go and read all of them, work out all of the dependencies, work out all of the Delta Live tables that are created across all of these different notebooks, and bring it together into one pipeline. So that's quite nice. It means I no longer have to, if I had like 50 different things to find, I wouldn't have to have the largest notebook known to man, which obviously is a pain when it comes to DevOps and managing the development lifecycle. If everything's all in one giant code block, that's no good. So the ability to actually create a single pipeline that actually amalgamates across a load of notebooks makes sense. It's all good. I've also got this add configuration. So in the last video, you saw me kind of create a generic bog standard pipeline. Then as soon as it was created, open up settings, and you got that JSON file that you can just go in and edit, and that's where you can do your cluster settings, you can do parameters, you can do loads of stuff inside there. Now they've said, well, actually, well, if people are going to do that, why not just expose a key value pair mapping here? So if I had a particular, if I wanted to add in my parameter that I was expecting people to do, I can then do, I can basically augment and decorate that JSON with additional bits of information, additional attributes I can then call upon from my code, which is great. I'm not going to do any right now. Again, location, I'm going to throw into, not actually going to do this, so it doesn't really matter. Triggered and continuous, we will come on to in a future video when we talk about streaming. And we've now actually got a little bit of cluster information, which is super useful. So we didn't used to be able to go in and edit much of this stuff. So the fact that we can now dive in and say, from the get-go, rather than have to, it by default picks the cluster size for me, and then we have to edit that JSON to say, no, actually, please use this machine type and this number of workers. We at least are exposed to the number of workers it's going to use. So we still don't get access to the machine type from here. We'd still have to create a custom bit of JSON, kind of augment that pipeline settings if you wanted to override the cluster, but at least we get a bit of information so we can dive in and change it. So that's cool. Again, switching over to development so it doesn't start running automatically and doing its own stuff. I don't know why it doesn't. If I create the new thing, why does it go to production, not development? I've just created that. I've just hit go. It's not ready for production yet. Anyway, so you can see that's gone. It's given us our thing. So it's automatically filled in things like that auto scale for me based on my stuff I've done. And we would see configuration and a load of attributes if we'd set any config in here. So that's getting a little bit better. It's changed slightly. And that's it. So actually, if I'm going to do a little blue Peter, I'm going to go to one I made earlier. If I dive into my SQL pipeline, DAT SQL example, that's the one I called it. There we go. So this is exactly the same as the one we did last time that was in Python. So it's still got the same data. It's done the definition of my different Delta Live tables in exactly the same way. I still got the same information coming from it, so I can still dive in to my flow progress. I can go and get things like the metrics, the expectations it's done. So just a little proof. So this is going to that same DLT with SQL. So we can dive in there and see that is that DLT with SQL, and this is just the SQL definition. So it is entirely up to you. You can use the SQL syntax to say create live table as blah, 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 blah. Or you can use the Pyspark at DLT, set your expectations, go and build a data frame. They do exactly the same thing, which is great. So I kind of there's a little bit of, I just had to prove it. I had to prove it to myself in the back of my head that they are doing the exact same thing. Now, that's the first piece. Now, the second piece when it comes to say this new bit of functionality, so that we can now actually chop and change and start to use little bits of SQL, why would that be a good idea? So I'm going to do a quick clone. So this is our initial config with SQL. Go and slap some stuff in there. So let's just, if we get rid of some of this stuff and kind of simplify, if we're just talking about that middle bit, right? So we had, this was our original example. So this is taking from our raw table. It's saying I want to read, so DLT, not Spark, so DLT.read from our clickstream raw, which is the earlier table defined. And then I want to add a new column, which is casted from an int. I want to do with column name, I want to rename two columns, and I want to change the order I'm selecting things. Now that, you know, again, if you're using lots of Pyspark, you'd be well aware that Pyspark's generally fairly long-winded compared to writing the same thing in SQL. So we nip over to our previous one and we look at the same thing. Again, that middle table defined the same way. Let's just put it in SQL mode so you can see it nicely. If we go, whoop. So to do exactly the same thing in SQL is like that. And generally, I don't know about you, but for me, the expectations, I think I prefer in Pyspark, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the actual SQL, that kind of just implicit renames that are in line, defining the columns and as just to see it straight SQL calculations, which is what we're doing anyway. That's just a lot tidier for me. So the ability to mix and match just means we can start to edit these things and just make it a little bit cleaner. So what can we do? We can do two things. Firstly, this one straight thing, we can say, well, actually, I no longer want to do a data frame read of a existing table. Instead, I want to do Spark, some switching, and I want to say spark.table. And then I can point to that thing. So I can say, I want to do that. So it's kind of just switching it around a little. So I'm still going to do the same Pyspark transformations, but instead of actually saying I'm using dlt.read, I'm using spark.table. Sure, not a big major change there. That's something we can do. If that's your preferred syntax for doing stuff, absolutely fine. Do note that in the logic that was creating that clickstream raw, we didn't specify live. Live is actually using a bit of a shortcut that you can use when you're writing SQL. For example, if we take the SQL command from the previous raw bit, go down here a little bit. So we can see in this, the select it's doing to get that raw, it starts JSON dot. And that is a little syntax shortcut they've put into the SQL engine inside of Spark. So if you wanted to read from a delta table, you can see delta dot and then pass it a path. And that's the same as doing spark.read.delta, spark.read.parquet, spark.read.json. It's giving you a shortcut to being able to read from a particular file type. It's basically, rather than have to say, specify as part of the table create script, you can specify as part of the path, and it will implicitly know that it's reading JSON in this case. So what they've done is they've done the same thing for Delta live tables. So because we're selecting from a table that is live.clickstream.raw, that is not telling us which Hive database it's in. That's telling us it's a live table. So when we're doing that spark.table, we need to say it's going to be a live table. You're expecting to read live.clickstream.raw. So that's one thing, and for me, there's not too much value there, right? That's a very similar way of doing that same thing. There isn't. In fact, I've written more characters. Oh, my character count has gone up. However, what we can do instead of all of that is do spark.sql. And then in that case, we can actually take this entire select string and throw that in there. So we can instead say, I want to take it, do a multi-line, and to do that. Now that will do exactly the same thing, except suddenly I've actually mixed and matched. So I've still got my expectations, I've still got my Delta live table and Pyspark. I'm still using the nice, I can still make it dynamic, which is the main benefit of doing Pyspark, except I don't have to write out all my transformations in a long-winded form. I can just write it like that. And that suddenly makes life a lot easier. So I can start to do a little bit more because I'm injecting the SQL into it. So that for me is a nice improvement. So when it came out and said, well, you can now use spark.sql, like I had a bit of feedback. So I'm going, can't we already use SQL? What's the change here? That's the change. I can now make things dynamic. And actually we can go even further than that, right? I can do that whole thing. I could just be in my SQL statement. And then actually somewhere up here is part of this thing. I can say my SQL statement is equal to, did I copy that? Yeah. And that'll work. So I can be generating variables elsewhere in that same notebook and then using that variables inside my return function. So it means I can start to do some fancy stuff. Again, this is still just a data frame, right? I can do with column. I could add in some audit. I can augment whatever's written in terms of that SQL in normal Pyspark. But I can have that starting base as a little bit of SQL that I've injected into it. So that's the big change. So I've made a bit of a mix. So I went through that first starter one that was all Pyspark, and I basically just jammed in where it made sense to augment it with the SQL syntax rather than using the Pyspark syntax. I've done it. So this is my best of both worlds kind of attempt. So we're still saying I want to get my JSON path from a variable because then I could look it up at runtime if I needed to. I'm saying a new table, so I'm using the Pyspark syntax, and that hasn't really changed. So that's the same as it used to be. We've done the same thing we've just done over here. So I've just replaced that whole dlt.read with that spark.sql, selecting from the live.clickstream_raw as a SQL string. My expectations and everything else is still coming from Pyspark. And then that next step is doing that same one. So I'm saying, well, the top Spark referrers, I'm doing the same thing. I've just taken the SQL from it. I've jammed it in. So I've got my 3 tables, one which is using pure Pyspark, and then 2 which is using a little mix and match of Pyspark and SQL. And that's what we can do now. So we've got the power to mix and match, have a bit of a play, get it working the way it should work for us. Again, just to prove that out. So this is the one that's using that same DLT with Pyspark example. And we get the same picture. We get the same thing of its... doesn't want to move that down. No, okay. I think I've zoomed in too much. There we go. So they get that same idea of those same 3 tables. We get all the same information from them. Nothing's actually functionally changed. It's all just about how we use language and how dynamic we can make things. So that suddenly becomes super, super useful. So yeah, that is the main bit I wanted to cover. This is like short and sweet today, isn't it? Yeah, only 16 minutes. The one final thing I wanted to quickly explain is I mentioned that I kind of like the expectations coming from Pyspark. Now, again, that's for the same reason as having that path up here. Having things variable driven means that we can then suddenly make it dynamic. So I can say, I want to actually just have that come from a variable. And there's a nice little switch. If we go into the language when we're talking about expectations, and we'll come on to this as another thing, I reckon. We got where have we got our things? I reckon it is in our user guide. Here we go. So we've got expectations which can be passed in as straight strings. So we can do that, and that's fine. The big thing for me is that we can do multiple expectations. So expect all. And that means that at the top of my notebook, I can actually just have a bit of a map, which is, doing that kind of little JSON key value pair of here's all the expectations I want to see. And then I can pass it in as a variable. So it means I could have a lookup. And for me, anything I can make metadata driven is that's how I roll, right? So I could have all of my expectations as that kind of object. So it's just got this bit of JSON that I've gone and looked up. I've looked into a Cosmos DB or a metadata string or a bit of JSON in my lake. Doesn't matter. So it goes and gets all those things. And then actually I can just have that same syntax of that expect all. So I can say, instead of having an expect and pointing to a single hard-coded expectation, I can say expect all, and then I can pass in that. Let's call it expect list, make it a little bit more explicit that it's a variable passing in. So it means I can do things like that. So I could pass in a different variable, which is my expect all was a list or my fails and things. And it means I can just make it a little bit more rule driven. So a business user can be editing the expectations somewhere separately from having to redeploy my notebooks and change all my code base. So that's why I quite like that mix. So being able to use a little bit of SQL, a little bit of Pyspark means I can control how dynamic things are. So I can choose, mix and match the best language for the best thing. If I'm trying to define transformations and I'm trying to have it so a user recognizes the actual bit of SQL, then I might as well do my business transformations in SQL. Whereas if I wanted to be looking up things at runtime and being very dynamic, then I might as well do it in Pyspark because it's easier to make that parameter driven. And that's what we've got here. So yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to go through today. Just having a look at how SQL changes the game and how it changes that idea. Now, fully expect that a lot of the whole thrust of making it available entirely in SQL means we can have citizen ETL. We can have business users who are fairly SQL savvy, just defining their own pipelines, and then it can run itself. They don't need to know how to manage dependencies and manage restartability and manage scheduling and all of that kind of stuff. They can just write out, create this table, it depends on that table, create this table, select from that table, and then all of that gets taken care of. But then we can also have the engineering approach where we're building out generic pipeline scripts and we're baking in some of that SQL and we're starting to mix and match. So super interesting, really, really cool to see the direction that it's heading in. And yeah, let me know how you get on. Let me know if you've had a play with trying to mix and match that. And how dynamic have you got these working? One of the next videos I want to do is I've got a nice generic Delta Live Table notebook that I can use to load one of 10 different tables. And I just pass it the same notebook with parameters, with metadata lookups and all that kind of stuff. So you can do it. It is possible. And I'll show you how that works. It's interesting stuff. Cool. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know if you got any questions. Do like and subscribe if you liked and you want to subscribe. And I'll catch you next time for digging into things even further. Cheers.